All right, guys, good evening. I'm glad that you are here, whether you are in person or you're watching online tonight. We are continuing our series, which we've been in it for probably over a year, just based on the questions that we've had, and still have some more to come, obviously. And then anybody that asks, texts me, emails me, I just work those into a Wednesday night, and we answer them here. So this is what we do. So the Bible has answers. And so the question for tonight is, and this is a fun one. This is a fun one. I don't know if I have been or ever have looked this in depth into this text in Genesis 6. But the question specifically was, it was a little bit longer than this because they were asking some other things about this. But in essence, the question is, who are the sons of God and the Nephilim in Genesis chapter 6? So, and if you have any, if you've ever dabbled in any one of these things, and if you've dabbled in sons of God, you've dabbled in the Nephilim as well, just because they're both mentioned in Genesis 6 in verses 1 through 4 together, and so you really wouldn't read them. I mean, we'll talk about are they separate or are they kind of intertwined, but you really wouldn't just read it one or the other. You'd read both, and you would look at it critically, both of them. So, but this is a super interesting question. There's a ton of debate around this text, and there's multiple views on each thing. So first, I want to say this. This text and this issue, it is not the gospel. It is not a salvific thing, but it is in the Scriptures, and so God is not giving us something at random and just trying to fill stuff. So we need to read this. We need to desire to understand it and use context, its place within the redemptive story, and then also what does the New Testament have to say about it. Kind of look at the whole Bible and go, how does this fit into the story? And there's going to be some stuff as we talk that you may just be like, that's kind of blowing my mind. And there may be some stuff I say tonight that you go, well, that's crazy. Like, I didn't even know that was a thing, or I wasn't even sure about that. Or if you're at another church, you may just say, my pastor's never spoken about that or never talked about it. So, but tonight we will talk about it, and there's a lot of stuff online. If you just YouTube or Google this, there's a ton of theories and a ton of stuff, and I think some of it just gets really extrapolated out almost into the fantasy type stuff. That probably has to do with just the culture that we live in, the time that we live in. So we want to just try to go, what does the Bible say? And then kind of draw our conclusions from that specifically. So I want to make this point before we start, just so we kind of know ultimately where the application lies with this. So the context of these verses, when we get to Genesis 6, 1 through 4, which we'll read in just a second, the context of these verses is to relay to the readers of this the extent of wickedness that has come upon the earth and God's justness and His rightness to cleanse it. That needs to be the focal point of understanding the Nephilim and the sons of God and all the wickedness that the Bible says was going on at this time before the Lord flooded the earth. And He preserved, obviously, Noah and the ark, animals and his family. But we need to kind of understand that that's the context. I don't want to get lost in the weeds and just run off in rabbit trails and go, well, is there any application to this? Well, the application is that God prevails over wickedness, and He does not stand for that ultimately. So we just need to understand that. So here we go. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, it says this: When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So this is where we kind of get, just like if you just read over this and go, what in the world does that mean? And probably just kind of keep reading if you're not really investigating and looking deep into the text, okay? So we got a few things there. We got Nephilim, we got sons of God, we got man, we got the daughters that were a product of men's relations with their wives. So we have that, and then we have at the very end men of renown, and we have mighty men. So what does all of that kind of mean? So let me go back a little bit. I want to kind of give some context for this. So this event, this text in Genesis 6 is taking place before the flood. So it's taking place right before the flood. We get this information. But let's kind of go back. So obviously there are people in this text right here, or beings in this text that are reproducing. They are having children, and for whatever is going on at the time, there's brokenness and wickedness, and God is not pleased with that. Now, if we go back to Genesis 1:28, we have this command where God says to Adam and Eve, what? Be fruitful and multiply. Like, subdue the earth and fill it. So we have this kind of command in Genesis 1, this reproduction and multiplication view that is highly and extremely positive in the text. And it is necessary for image bearers to do this, to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it. That is a good thing. So let's look at Genesis 1:26, and then we'll go through verses 28 as well. So Genesis 1:26 through 28 says, Then God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him. Male and female, He created them. So that is the creation. That is Genesis 1. That is the sixth day of creation. God makes man and woman in His image. Very clear. And God blessed them. Verse 28. And God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heaven, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So God gives that command and says, go, now be fruitful and multiply. It's a good thing, right? We want more humans, more image bearers, more imago Deis on the earth. So then we have in Genesis chapter 3, we have the fall of man. So they are tempted, they submit to that temptation, they fall. And then in Genesis chapter 4, we have Cain, who is born to Adam and Eve, killing Abel, his brother, and then being sent away from the presence of the Lord and settling in the land of Nod, which was east of Eden. So all that goes down. So Genesis 1 and 2, everything's good. Genesis 3, we have the fall. Genesis 4, Cain kills Abel. And then Genesis 4 as well, at the very end of Genesis 4, Adam and Eve will have another son named Seth. And then Genesis 4, 25 through 26, let me read you this. Genesis 4, 25 and 26 says this, And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. So this is a good thing, right? Cain kills Abel. Abel dies. The Lord rebukes Cain and sends Cain out and says, you go over there. You go over there. So he goes and he starts this city in the land of Nod. He has this place where he settles and his offspring will be produced there. And then we have in Genesis 4:25, Adam and his wife Eve, they come together. They have another son. His name is Seth. And then Seth has a son. And it says at this time, people begin to call upon the name of the Lord. So things, obviously that was kind of hectic with Cain and Abel. But now that Seth's here, his line's coming. And it's like, okay, this is a good thing. Like things are going well. If we know this, is that through Seth's line, ultimately we will get to Noah. And through that line, we will ultimately get to Abraham. And through that line, we will ultimately get to the Messiah, Jesus. So we follow this kind of line. Genesis 5 says this, that Adam's descendants, we have Adam's descendants in Genesis 5, the list, from Seth all the way to Noah. So when we do the math here, from Adam to the flood, there is 1,656 years. Now, if you're just reading through the Bible and you're just kind of flipping through, looking at the genealogies in Genesis 5, you may flip real quick to the flood and go, wow, if you do the calculations correct, 1,656 years between Adam and the flood happening. So, in other words, there's a lot of time for stuff to happen between Adam and the fall and the flood that God sends to flood the entire earth. There's a lot of time there. So this is how crazy that it's gotten. So if we look at our present text, Genesis 6, 1 through 4, the one that the question was about, we see multiplication and reproduction with these daughters of man and the sons of God, and the Lord is not pleased with what's going on. So much so, he's so much unhappy with it, that in Genesis 6, 5 through 8, which is the text right after this one, it says this: the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But, verse 8, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And so God will use Noah and his family and place them in the ark, the vessel, and seal them, and they will preserve the line of Seth. And so God will be faithful to his promises that he gave Adam and Eve in the garden before they were kicked out. So their hope is what? Adam and Eve, all of the descendants, all the way to Noah. What is their hope? Genesis 3, they know that the crusher of the snake, Jesus, they don't know his name, but they know that the crusher of the snake, he's coming. He's coming one day, and that line will be preserved all the way to Jesus. So we understand that. So now let's look at Genesis 6, 1 through 4. So in the text, when we look at this, we have several, like who are the players who were in Genesis chapter 4? Or Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. We have man in verse 1. Man is mentioned in verse 1, this text. Man is mentioned in verse 1. Draw a line down there because these are the folks in 1 through 4. We have man in verse 1. We have daughters in verse 1 as well. Now the daughters are the product of man's reproducing. So they're having intimacy with their wives or ladies, and so daughters are being produced. So we have man, we have daughters, and then in verse 2 we have this phrase, sons of God, which in the Hebrew is distinctly different from man and distinctly different from daughters. So right now we have three groups. We have man, we have daughters, we have sons of God, and then we have the Nephilim. They're mentioned in verse 4, and then in verse 4 again we have mighty men and men of renown. So we have several categories of folks here within the text. So I want to specifically focus on, for now, because of the question, sons of God. The sons of God. So there are in essence three views on what the sons of God mean here in the text. The first view is that they are fallen angels. That they are in essence, a fallen angel would be basically a demon, because that's what Satan is a fallen angel. And you can even look at Revelation 13, when Satan falls and his tail swipes, he's pictured as a dragon, and 1/3 of the angels fall with him. So we do know that there are fallen, broken angels. We understand that. We did a whole series. We did talking about angels and demons on another Wednesday night, probably 4, 5, 6 months ago. And so we referenced that and we talked about this. But the first theory is that they are fallen angels, that sons of God is actually a fallen angel. The second view is that these would be evil judges, these tyrannical human judges and kings that have done nothing but just corrupt the earth. They love violence. They love death. That's the other view. And possibly people have said that they are demon-possessed, that this group is demon-possessed and they're crazy. Wickedness is just expanding. And so therefore that is a reason why God must flood the earth. So fallen angel theory, you have the evil judges and kings theory that possibly demonically possessed. We don't really know. And then the third theory is that sons of God is used as a good term, and it is referencing the descendants of Seth. And what that means is that theory says that the descendants of Seth, who were supposed to be what? The godly line. They're calling on the name of the Lord, right? Adam and Eve, well, I mean, they had many sons and daughters, the text says, but the three main ones that are mentioned are Cain, Abel, and Seth. And so Abel is dead. Cain has been booted out, and so now Seth, through his line, there's going to be a preserving all the way to Noah, and then a preserving all the way to Abraham, and then a preserving all the way to Jesus. That's going to be how this works itself out. So sons of God, the third theory is that they are descendants of Seth, and those descendants of Seth who were at one point being godly, but within this amount of time period, the 1,656 years, they have now started to marry and intermingle with the daughters of Cain, those who were ungodly. So it's like Seth's line and Cain's line, they're now intermingling, and that's become a problem. Because that kind of calling on the name of the Lord isn't happening anymore because they're intertwining. And so sons of God is used here as kind of a good term to talk about Seth, or Seth's line, but Seth's line's not doing the right thing. They're intermingling and marrying with Cain's daughters, and that's a problem. Now, the problem with ultimately the second one is there's just not a whole lot of evidence elsewhere in the Scripture to really support this. So I would say, now, there again, I'm going to kind of just show my cards and kind of tell you where I land on this, but I don't believe that this is very liable or practical. And one reason will be because of the Hebrew language that we have when we read sons of God. I just think that's just a real generalized statement. Now, were there evil judges and kings probably around? Yeah, I'm sure. Obviously, at that point, people are being wicked, so there's probably those around. I do not think that this is a reference to sons of God. The descendants of Seth, a man who I deeply respect, Ken Ham, the founder of Answers in Genesis and the Creation Museum and the Ark exhibit in Kentucky, he holds to this view. He wrote an article last year finally stating where he lands. And he even said, because we're a big supporter of Answers in Genesis, we love their stuff, have curriculum out there. He said that the Answers in Genesis team does not make a specific claim or stance on this, like as far as their doctrine goes, because it's not an issue that is really worth arguing about. And he says all of our guys on our team have different thoughts and opinions and stances, but he lands on the descendants of Seth being correct. Now, I know Ken. I got a chance to meet him at the G3 conference. Super great guy. He makes a really good argument in the article that he writes. But I will say this: I'm not necessarily convinced of that either. I probably would have landed there had I not, having gone really deep into understanding this. So, there again, Ken, if you listen to this, I love you. I just don't agree with that statement there. So I believe that the stance is fallen angels. I believe that is the right interpretation for the text, that the sons of God is referencing fallen angels. Now, when we say that, what we're saying is exactly what you think we're saying. It's that prior to the flood, fallen angels who were in a humanoid body, and obviously a male body, because it's saying that they took for themselves these daughters of man, they had intimacy. They were married. They had sex. And from that were produced offspring, the mighty men or the men of renown. So let's go through and just kind of see where else in the Old Testament this phrase, sons of God, is used. It is used 5 times. It is used once here in Genesis 6, 1 through 4. And then it is used in Job, Job 2, Job 31, and then Daniel 3. So let's just kind of read those texts because I think that is important. And somebody might say, well, that sounds so crazy. Like, what do you mean fallen angels taking on bodies? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Well, if you remember, and this was something yesterday I was thinking about that I have not heard many people make the argument for, but in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, do you guys remember the story? God rains down fire. When the 2 angels come to Lot's house, what do the people in Sodom and what do they want to do to those angels who were in a human-like body? They think they're men. They want to do what? Yes, they want to have sex with them. They want to, in essence, rape them. That's what they're asking for them to do. So, but when you read like the story of that, is it Genesis 17 or 18? 17, 18, or 19. When you read the story of that, basically Lot hides them into the house and kind of bars the door. Now, obviously, they blind them and they're unable to get to them. But the understanding is this, is that they're angels who have taken on a human male body anatomy, if you will. So the thought is, at least in the story, if they were allowed to, and the angels didn't stop it, they would have tried to do that to them. So when somebody says, well, there's no way an angel can embody a person. Now, I'm not talking about possession of somebody. I'm not talking about they come into somebody that's already living and act as an angel. I'm talking about they, because this is distinctly different, they are actually have taken on a human body themselves and have convinced people that they are in that form of a man. So I think yes. In the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the angels ate with them. So they're eating food, they're taking in stuff. Now, how all of that works out from like a mysterious divine standpoint, I don't know. It's just saying that when somebody says, I don't think that could have happened, well, there's obviously an occasion where they have taken on a human body. Obviously, no other occasion where they've had intimacy or intercourse with a human, but still, this would be, I think, the best place to land. So let's read Job. Let's read Job chapter 1, verse 6. It says this. We see the phrase, sons of God, the same word as we see right here. Now, this word, every time that we see it in Genesis 6, Job 1, Job 2, Job 31, Daniel 3, is the Hebrew word Ben Elohim. So Elohim being the word for God in Hebrew, and then Ben being the word for son. So this phrase in Hebrew is used all throughout these texts. Job 1:6 says this, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. So these sons of God, these angelic beings that are there, are obviously present in Job 1, like with the Lord. Like they're in his council, if you will, in his arena. And then in Job 2:1 it says, again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. So you have the same word, Ben Elohim, in Job 1, and then Job 2:1, and then Job 31, 4-7 says this, and this is God talking to Job, having a conversation with him after all this calamity has fallen on him, and Job has asked the question, like, man, what in the world? What is happening? And this is what God says. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? Or what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Same word, Ben Elohim. Now in this, Job 1, Job 2, Job 31, what are they referencing? They are in the what? They are in the courts with the Lord. This is not happening. None of this is happening. None of this is happening on the earth. They are in the presence of God, or they have been able to what? Enter the presence of God and interact in dialogue, as well as, interesting enough, that Satan is able to come into that presence and ask of the Lord about tempting Job ultimately. So, the other place is Daniel 3, 24-25. You guys will know this story. It is the three Jewish exiles, if you will, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel 3, 24-25. This is when King Nebuchadnezzar, they would not worship, they would not bow down to the golden statue. So King Nebuchadnezzar said, you won't bow down, we throw you in the fire. Okay? And they told him, they said, look, King, oh King, your kingliness, we are sorry to inform you that we will not be bowing down to anything. We'll not be praying to any other gods. We will only pray to the Lord. And if the Lord chooses not to rescue us from this specific situation, then we will praise the Lord. And if he chooses to, then we will praise the Lord. But what we will not do is we will not bow down for the statue. So the king Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste, and he declared to his counselors, this is after he has thrown them into the fire, he threw three of them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, into the fire, and he says, did we not cast, he's telling his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and they said to the king, true, O king. He answered and said, but I see 4 unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of God's, Ben Elohim. So So in that situation, which that's kind of a mysterious text as well, you have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the flame, fiery furnace. They're walking around unbound, and he sees a fourth. That he said the appearance of the fourth was like a son of God. In other words, some type of angelic being is present with them in the fire and in the flame. And they're not being hurt by it. So the Hebrew word, Ben Elohim, used here, Genesis 6, Job, Daniel 3. So, for that reason, I would have to say that if in every one of these texts, Ben Elohim, the word used for sons of God in all these texts, is referencing an angelic being, an angel. If that's what it's referencing, then I don't see why that Genesis 6, 1 through 4 would mean something else if it was in reference to a descendant of Seth or an evil judge or evil king. It wouldn't make any sense within the understanding of like Hebrew writing. So I believe that if Moses had meant something different by this, he would have simply used another word. He could have simply said in the text, the sons of Seth married the daughters of Cain, and then they produced these wicked, evil, crazy offspring. He could have just simply said that. Like, it makes no sense that he would use really 5 different like groups in this section to simply lay out something that was like, was he trying to be confusing about it? What was the point of that? And so this has been much debate, because I think some people go, I hear this view, I hear the fallen angel view, and I just go, there's just no way, man. So let me tell you this. The first time I ever heard the argument about fallen angel, the first time I heard that, you know what I said? That sounds ridiculous. Like, it just doesn't sound, like, it just sounds silly. Like I'm not saying that it's not possible in the realm of something, I guess it could be, but when you look at this, you go, okay, is that really what happened? And honestly, this is probably what I just understood it as for a while. Just, okay, it's the descendants of Seth. He's just making a point. What's the big deal? But the more that I studied, I was like, man, the evidence is really heavily falling on the fallen angels. Like, that's where the evidence really falls and really like points towards. So let's see this. Is there any place in the New Testament that may give us some help for this too, right? If you're reading something in the Old Testament, you're like, man, that's really complicated and kind of overwhelming. Let's look to the New Testament and see if we get some clarity on it. So 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 5 says this. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. If he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. So just notice that Peter references 2 things in a row. He references angels that had sinned, and it says God did not spare them, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness. And then immediately in 5, he says, and if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, like, you see what he does? He mentions angels that are sinned, and then he mentions right after that Noah, like right in conjunction. So that's obviously all in one train of thought. So we have in 2 Peter 2, 4 through 5, this understanding of angels have done something and they've fallen. Now also we have Jude 5 through 7. I want to read the whole thing so that we kind of get a good picture of this. So Jude 5, Jude doesn't have any chapters. It's just Jude and then the verse. So Jude 5 through 7 say this. Now I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved a people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. Verse 6, and the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under, and he uses the same words as Peter uses, under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. So I think that text, Jude 5 and 7, kind of blows this out of the water, because Jude 5 and 7 references what? The angels who did not stay in their own position of authority, but what? Left their proper dwelling place. He has kept them in eternal change under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. So until the second coming, until the great judgment, like they're being locked and kept up. But why are they being locked and kept up? Because they've done something wicked and they've left their place that they were supposed to be in. They have left that place and they have come and they have done wicked things. In verse 7, it says this, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which what? Which likewise, meaning likewise what? Just like the angels did, indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire. So if the question is, well, angels have an intimacy, Jude 5 and 7 almost tell us that just like Sodom and Gomorrah did, likewise, just like the angels did right here. Genesis 6, 1 through 4. Men gave birth to daughters. The sons of God saw them attractive, went after them. They took for the wives all that they desired, and had offspring with them. So that makes really good sense. So Jude 5 and 7, as well as 2 Peter 2, 4 through 5, give us an insight. Because I used to read this and I was like, what happened? I mean, what in the world? Like, I just not connecting the dots with the New Testament, even referencing this stuff that's happening. I mean, because in 2 Peter 2, 4 through 5, he references Noah being preserved. So he's referencing what? Known stories in the Old Testament, so that his readers go, okay, yeah, we absolutely get that, 100%. So with all of this evidence kind of being mounted and kind of pushed, that is why I would land with those being fallen angels. So any pushback or objection? This has kind of been the one text that has kind of been the pushback for angels having intimacy, and even fallen angels in a human body marrying like human women. Matthew 22, 29 through 30. Some of you will know this text. So there is this group of lawyers, and they're trying to catch Jesus in a weird kind of situation. They're trying to catch him in a weird situation. They're basically saying there's this lady who has had multiple husbands, right? And the husbands have all died, and she is marrying the next person in line in the family. So she's had multiple husbands. I think it's maybe seven. Maybe it's seven, I believe, in Matthew 22. She has had 7 husbands. Actually, you know what? Let's just... Yes, the legal right marriage. Matthew 22, I'll just go ahead and read it right quick just so we have it. It says this. They're asking a question, and this I'll start in verse 24. Matthew 22, 24, saying, they said, Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies having no children, and his brother must marry the widow and raise up the offspring for his brother. Now there were 7. Now they pose this question. They're trying to catch him in a little conundrum. So they give him this kind of this question, this problem. They said, now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died, and having no offspring, left his wife to his brother. So that was pretty typical in the Near Eastern world. If you married somebody and you were the husband and you died, typically your brother would be the one who took your wife as his wife. That's just the way it was. Like, women had no rights, they had no say, and so it was not good for them to be without a husband. So they needed to be under some protection and authority. So too, the second and third, down to the 7th died. So 7 brothers. The first one had a wife, he dies, next one dies, next one dies. All of them died down to the 7th one. So now what? She's ultimately had what? Legally, she has had how many husbands? 7 husbands. After them, all the women died. Okay? So everybody dies. And then verse 28, it says, in the resurrection, therefore, of the 7, whose wife will she be? For they all had her as their wife. Like they all had her as their wife. Who was she supposed to be? But Jesus answered them. He says this, you are wrong, because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. So people have used this text and says, listen, right there. At the resurrection, we are not given in marriage, nor will there be marriage. There won't be any of that. So my wife, Stephanie, at the resurrection, when we're with the Lord, new heavens, new earth, I will not be her husband. We will not be married. There will not be marriage in heaven. There just won't be, right? If you married somebody and somebody died and you remarried, like that's irrelevant. That's for here and now on the earth. That's not for there. And so people have said, well, listen, there's no way that angels could have relationships based on the statement that Jesus makes here in Matthew 22. But the difference is this. It says what? But they are like the angels in where? Heaven. This, Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is what? They are on the earth. They have been booted, kicked out, left, abandoned their post, if you will. They have left and rebelled, and they are no longer in the court, the heavenly court with God. They are on the earth being deceptive and destructive, no matter how beautiful or great or whatever that they might have looked. They are not in alignment with God's good plan and righteousness. They are committing wicked acts, and so therefore there is a brokenness to the entire thing. So, Matthew 22, though it may seem like, and I know that we talked a little bit before, like may have even said, oh, that sounds like a reasonable response. But this is not something that's happened in the heavenly courts. This is something that's happening on the ground here on the earth. So, they are among the people. They are the fallen angels. So, in conclusion, I would say that the sons of God in Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is referencing fallen angels who have come to earth or have been cast out. I mean, that's kind of not given to us, but they are evidently here. They find the daughters of man attractive, and so they marry them. They take for them their wives. They have intercourse, and they produce offspring, which we have in verse 4, the mighty men, the men of renown. So that kind of covers the sons of God. I think that's a good, I would land there. Now you may say, I'm not really convinced of that. I mean, I hear what you're saying, but I just don't know. Descendants of Seth, there's some really good scholars that would land there. But this text is highly debated anyway. Like it's a lot of wrestling. There again, and I would say this is not the gospel. It's not the gospel. It's something that happened prior to the flood, and so there we go. So now let's talk about the Nephilim. So we have sons of God, and let's talk about the Nephilim. There's the flip. So, the Nephilim. Now let's read Genesis 6 right quick. Genesis 6, 4, just so we can just read about the Nephilim, because they're mentioned in this one verse in Genesis. So it says this, the Nephilim, so this is kind of right after he mentions all the stuff about the chaos with the sons of God and the daughters of men. It says this, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. They were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So, we have two possible interpretations of the Nephilim and what's going on in Genesis 6:4. The first is this, the Nephilim are the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. So that is the first interpretation, that the Nephilim, that these guys, whoever they are, that they are a product, they are the offspring of the sons of God marrying and having intercourse with the daughters of men. So in other words, they are this like hybrid thing that has been produced because this fallen angel has had intimacy and intercourse and produced a child with this lady on the earth that's just a regular human. Like, that is the first kind of interpretation. Now, I will say this. This one had got a ton of, like, traction early on in history, mainly because the book of Enoch and several other Jewish writings have, like, prompted and promoted this view. Now, if you go and type in Nephilim, sons of God, if you go and type that in, there's a ton of people that I think would love to have this as their, like, stance. Because it makes for a really crazy, like just mind run. Like, oh gosh, these people produce these these crazy giants, if you will. Now we will talk about what the phrase Nephilim means. But the second possible interpretation, and the one that I think is the most probable based on the writing in the original Hebrew, is that the Nephilim were on the earth prior to the angels having relations with the human women, and they were there afterward. I want to read the text one more time. Genesis 6:4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, right? The text says they were on the earth in those days. Meaning what? In those days of the daughters of men and the sons of God marrying and mingling, they were on the earth in those days. And what? Also afterward. So they were there before and they were there after. When the sons of God came into the daughters of man and they bore children to them. I believe those are two distinct things that Moses is referencing. The Nephilim, and then he's referencing what happened that they bore children. But he's just kind of like, almost like saying, yeah, the Nephilim were there before and afterwards. It doesn't say, the text doesn't say that the Nephilim were the offspring, that they were born from the daughters of men and the sons of God. It doesn't say that. And then it says this, in the last sentence in Genesis 6:4, says, these were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Now, what's interesting is this. There are the number 2 view right here. There are 2 reasons why I believe that this is true over this. Now, I know some guys that hold this view, and they make a kind of an okay argument about it. But the reason why I don't, and I kind of clarified this with a couple of solid Old Testament scholars that know the Hebrew far better than I do. And the 2 things that kind of came out, one was this phrase in Genesis 6:4 says, and also afterward. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. This phrase, and also afterward, every single place in the entire Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, every time this is used, it is referencing, every time that it is used, it is referencing that what happened before this had continued to go on prior to whatever it's stating. In other words, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. Okay? That's a statement. And also afterward, meaning that anything that happened prior was already going on before we get to that afterward. When the sons of God came into the daughters of man. So prior to them coming into the daughters of man, the Nephilim exist. I think that's a clear understanding. Now, there again, you can make some arguments that the way that Hebrew is writing and the poetic flow of it, that it could mean this, but every time and also afterward is used in the Hebrew, it would be in alignment with what I'm saying, every time. Also, too, this is interesting, too, that in the Hebrew, almost every time in Hebrew, when a new sentence starts to make a new thought, or to make a fresh thought, if you will, or to make another point, it starts with and. Almost every time in the Hebrew. If it's making a new point, it starts with and, well, if you go and look at Genesis 6:4, it's 2 sentences. These were the mighty men who were of old and the men of renown. That sentence in the original Hebrew, if you look it up, does not start with and. So normally, when Moses does that, he is making almost what we would call a footnote. Like just a notation, just kind of, I'm giving you some more information about it. It's not to reference back to the original subject, the Nephilim. So, all that said, the also afterward and the second sentence not starting with and, I would say that this is the most probable view in understanding and reading of this. That the Nephilim were on the earth before all this happened, and they were on the earth after all this happened. That it was irrelevant about what's happening with the sons of God and the daughters of man. Their offspring that's being produced is not the Nephilim, I don't believe. I believe that their offspring that is produced is what they say, the men who were of old, the men of renown. Those are descriptive words to use for the offspring of the fallen angels and the women, their babies. That's what that's used for. So, I would say this. And so also, like when we look at kind of the breakdown of the word Nephilim, so Nephilim in Hebrew is Nephal. That is the word in Hebrew that they translate. So Nephal is the word in Hebrew, and it literally translates fallen ones, which is interesting because when you think about fallen ones, what is that in reference to? That they would fall? That they would, this word Nephilim is really in Hebrew. Any Hebrew scholar I spoke to was like, man, it's a really hard word to define because it's kind of a unique word. Now, what's interesting is this, and this is where I think all of this stuff gets played up and built up. The Septuagint, which is the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, translated into Greek, which happened in the intertestamental period. So the Septuagint was written and translated between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So before Jesus even arrives, this is written. They translate the word Nephal, Hebrew, same word that's used. They translate this word into Greek, gigantus, and then we get our English word, giants. There are even some translations that if you read, that in the English translation, when you read it now, it doesn't say this in the ESV, it says the Nephilim, but there are some translations, I don't know if the NIV has it, maybe somebody can look that up and see what translation has it, but some translations translate that word Nephilim just giants. And so I believe that when I first started reading as a new believer, whatever translation I had, it just said giants, and I thought, well, that's crazy. Giants, wow, So anyways, that's where all of that comes from. So originally, in the Hebrew, that word Nephal means fallen ones, which is Nephilim, what we get. But when you translate it from Hebrew into Greek, the Septuagint translators, they use the word gigantus in Greek, which translates to our English word giants. So from a very early on, before Jesus showed up, it was understood that the Nephilim were giants. It was just understood like that. So the question is, do you think that they were giants? Well, yeah, I think that they probably were. Most Hebrew writing labels them as giants, but the literal translation is fallen ones. So what does that correlate to? How does that kind of mix, or how do we use that? Now, the only other place in the Old Testament that Nephilim is used is in Numbers 13. So we have it here in Genesis 6:4, but then let's read Numbers 13:33. So a little bit of context for this. Numbers 13, 27 through 33. Moses is told by God, this is after Moses has left Egypt, right? They've left Egypt. They've been in the wilderness. The Lord's provided for them, and they come up on the promised land, the land of Canaan. So they come up on the promised land, which is ultimately what? The land that God promised them. This is, in the New Testament, this is Israel. This is the place where God's people will establish. This is where Jerusalem will be. So in the Old Testament, they come up on it, and Moses is told by God that he should send spies out into the land to look and see and kind of survey these people that what? God has said what? You will take. This will be your land. So Moses is commanded to send one man from every tribe. There's 12 tribes, so there's how many men? 12 guys. 12 guys will go. They do the reconnaissance, and then they report back to Moses and the people, and here's what they say to him. This is Numbers 13, 27 through 33. And they told him, we came to the land to which you sent us. Right? We came and scouted it out. The Lord told us to go do that. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. They even brought back some of its fruit because Moses said, bring back some of its fruit, some of the grapes. I want to see what the land is producing. However, this is what the spy said, however, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of Negeb. The Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites dwell in the hill country, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea along the Jordan. So what they're saying is that what? They said, we went and looked, we brought back some fruit, but there's some powerful groups that are all over the land that the Lord has told us to take. Verse 30. But Caleb, remember the two spies that were righteous and they would ultimately see in the promised land? Were Caleb and who was the other one? Remember? Joshua. So Caleb and Joshua, they're the ones that go, yeah, we know the Lord can give us victory over all of these powerful guys. So it says this in verse 30, but Caleb quieted the people before Moses. He was one of the spies, and he said, let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it. So Caleb and Joshua are like, what? Let's go get them. The Lord said, this is our land. He promised us that we could take it. It's flowing with milk and honey. You see the grapes we brought back, all the fruit that it produces. Like, let's go handle some business. The Lord said we'd have victory. Then the men who had gone up with him said this. So then the men, the other spies, Joshua was with Caleb, the other 10 get up and they said this, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. So they're like, man, there's some huge jokers there. And there we saw the Nephilim. Same word. Nephal, fallen ones. There we saw the Nephilim. In some translations, there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, who came from Nephilim. And we seemed, this is what they said, this is the report they gave, we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. Now, so there's a few thoughts on Numbers 13:27 through 33. Let's just say the average Israelite is 5'6", maybe, I don't know, 5'7". They're not a massively tall people. They're not a large people. They're not a large group of people. They're not humongous. They're not like itty bitty, but they're not big people. They're just not. So it says that there we saw these giants, these Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. Like, we know they're big jokers, and we seem to ourselves like what? Grasshoppers. And so we seem to them. So some people have said, well, what if they're just using hyperbole, saying they're just some really big guys, right? They're just some really big guys. But it's translated in the Greek, it's translated as gigantes, giants. So the question may be asked, like, well, how big were they? You know, in the book of Enoch, there are references in the book of Enoch that say that the giants, the Nephilim, were 100 feet tall. Like massive, like something out of a Marvel movie. Now, if that's true, if that correlation is true, and now these same Nephilim are here after the flood as well, right? Because that's a whole other kind of issue, is if they were before the flood, right, in Genesis 6, then after Genesis 7 and 8, like how are they still here? Like, what does that look like? Did one of Noah's daughters or sons' line is something in their line, and the wives they took is one of their lines, part that, and now that line keeps carrying on? I don't know. Like, there's just some questions, because obviously the same word Nephilim before the flood is the same word that's used here. So the assumption is that's the same group of people, or at least a line of those people are still active and still present after the flood, which is another kind of interesting issue to talk about as well. But so it's like, well, how do they survive the flood? Right? They're in Canaan when they scout the land, and so they see them and they're like, okay, same word used. So how did that happen? I don't know. But obviously the Israelites, at least the spies, go, these guys are humongous. We're like grasshoppers to them. So now I would assume this too, from an archaeological standpoint. If these Nephilim, this group of these army, these powerful tribes, if they are 50, 80, 100 feet tall, I mean, wouldn't we have, especially after the flood, during battle when they would kill these men, wouldn't we have some evidence of humongous bone structure? I mean, we have that for the dinosaurs. We have that for other humans. Like, wouldn't we be digging up like, dude, look at this leg bone. It's 20 feet long, right? His shin is humongous. If they are that tall. Now, I do think some of this just gets just extremely exaggerated over time, and the myth kind of keeps to roll. But it doesn't mean that they weren't giants, because if you're 5'7", and you see a bunch of guys walking around and you go, let's just say they were 7 foot tall or 8 feet tall. Let's just say they were. Would I compare myself as a grasshopper to somebody like that? I mean, I guess that's subjective, right? Whether you would relate to yourself. Notice this too, in the text, they don't even mention that they are Nephilim and they're humongously tall. They don't even mention that until after Caleb says, hey, we should go take them. The Lord said he'd give us victory. So is it just them responding going, well, they're humongous. You don't want to fight them. They're just all massively giants. So it is interesting to kind of go, are they just using that phrase? Is that and this is interesting too, because I was just thinking about it, like just as I was saying that, are they using that as a fear tactic? Oh, the Nephilim. Because of what? Why would they say that? Because they knew there used to be them on the earth, right? There used to be them. So maybe they're using it almost as you guys remember the Nephilim? We've been told about them from history. Like, those are the guys that are there. We don't want to mess with them. Because it's just the word Nephilim is not used anywhere else other than Genesis 6 and then Numbers 13. So it is interesting. And I don't know if I've come to a solid spot on that, but there's no doubt that these were massive. There's no doubt these were big jokers. Are we talking and powerful? Obviously, like dominating the landscape. Obviously, from all the wickedness and craziness that's going on. Now, I think they were men. I don't think these are some cyborg type things. I don't think they are. Now, if you're talking about the men of renown and the mighty men of old, from the sons of God, the angels that are fallen, and the human women, what were those? What ability did they have? Well, then that's kind of a whole other rabbit trail that you could run down. Because, and I'll just point this out, so there were other giants in the Old Testament as well. There were other giants that are listed. Now, the word giants that is used in these texts is not the same word Nephilim that is used here. It's a different word. So the Amorites, Amos 2, 9 through 10, discuss these giant men. Imam in Deuteronomy 2:10, the Zamzummim in Deuteronomy 2:20, Og, the king of Bashan, in Deuteronomy 3:11. I just want to read this text for you guys right quick. Deuteronomy 3:11. Deuteronomy 3, verse 11. So Deuteronomy 3:11 says this, for only Og, the king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, listen to this, behold, his bed was a bed of iron. It is not in Rabbah of the Amorites. It was 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth, according to the common cubit. How much was the cubit? 1.5 feet, so 13 feet by 4 cubits in breadth. So, in other words, this guy is a huge dude. For all intents and purposes, he's just a huge guy. However that happens. And they're thinking, okay, so through the bloodlines, there were people that were just really big. Like we look at maybe an NBA basketball player and go, that dude's 6'11". Or, I don't know if you guys know the newest player for the San Antonio Spurs. His name is Wemby. And I think he's from France. And he is like 7'5". And he's just humongous, long, skinny, lanky joker, just blocks shots like crazy. He literally just kind of like jumps about. He can stand on his tippy toes and just hold on the rim. It's like he's playing like a kid's basketball goal. When you're little, if you're playing basketball, you lower the goal so you can dunk on it. It's just like him playing. So, would you say he's 7'5", he's a giant? Would you say that? He's a giant. He's just really, really tall. But this guy is a giant. And then also, who's the most famous giant in the Scriptures? Goliath, right? David fights Goliath in 1 Samuel 7, 4 through 7. And I believe it says that he was, how many feet tall?
6 cubits in the span, which is
So
about
9'9". This guy's almost 10 feet tall. So talking about his spearhead was like 14 pounds, the spearhead. So all the weight, all the armor, he has to be a massive guy. So there again, there again, even his descendants, when you trace even the Philistines' enemies, like you can even look at, or the Philistines' like lineage, you can even see that his lineage probably dated back to some giant group. So, very easily, I could see the Israelites, if they walked into the land of Canaan and they saw a bunch of 10 or 12-foot jokers, they may go, yeah, we seem like a grasshopper. I mean, I'm sure if you walked up and you saw somebody that was 13, 14, 15 feet tall, you may be like, okay, all right. Yeah, yeah, if you see a huge person. So maybe it is kind of relative to that too. Now, let me say this. Somebody asked a question. They said, Will, what do you think about Greek mythology in relation to the sons of God and the daughters of men having offspring? What if they were powerful, had incredible abilities? And that's where you get into the book of Enoch and some other Hebrew writings where they reference that these men, these people that were birthed from these fallen angels and these human women had extraordinary abilities. So somebody said, what about Greek mythology? And I just said, I don't know. I mean, I don't know, like, I don't really know what to think about that. But it makes sense, right, that some of these greats within Greek mythology, Zeus, Poseidon, Hercules, Ares, some of these folks within Greek mythology, what if that has been passed down from some of the abilities of these other people? Not that they had any type of like God-like ability. Obviously, the Lord, like the earth is a footstool for him. But what if they had extraordinary abilities? Or what if all the women that just kind of drawn to them because of what? These fallen angels had some type of special ability. Now, it's important to note that the Scriptures just don't unpack any of that. I think that's what's important to note because we're talking about the Bible has answers. The Bible just doesn't answer that. Now, is that something to kind of think about and go, okay, what about these ancient figures like Gilgamesh or Ares or Zeus or Poseidon or Hercules? Or what about kind of demigods, right? Like they have intimacy with these ladies, and so out of that is produced this, if the angels can come out of heaven and take on a human body, if they give birth to somebody, could that kid not grow up and have some ability because the Bible calls them men of renown? These heroes of old. What if they did extraordinary things? I don't know. Maybe that is a thing. Maybe that's not a thing. But it makes sense that a lot of the mythology, because when somebody says, what about Hercules? It's like, where did he come from? Where did that even get traced back to? Just something we just imagined? Or is there some historical inflation from something that happened years ago before the flood that now that's why like this stuff has become like myth and legend? I don't know. But I do know this. 1 Timothy 1, 3 through 4, Paul warns this to the young pastor Timothy at Ephesus. This is what he says. Because I believe he is probably referencing some of the historical Jewish writings that are running amok with all this crazy talk. He says, as I urged you when I was going to Macedonia, remain at Ephesus so that you may charge certain persons not to teach any different doctrine, nor to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies which promote speculations rather than the stewardship from God that is by faith. So, what was happening is there was, in the book of Enoch, and this may be what Paul could have even been addressing, is that in the book of Enoch, there are lineage of angels. It gives kind of this genealogy, if you will, of angels, starting with all these angels, all the way down to Satan. In the book of Enoch, really, if I've read some of the cliff notes of it, it really blames all of the evil and the brokenness and the stuff of the flood. It blames all of that on what? Angels, demons, demonic stuff, Satan. It kind of puts all the blame on that. 1 Timothy 4:7 says this. He says it again to Timothy. Have nothing to do with irreverent, silly myths. Rather, train yourself for godliness. Because here's what happens. The world would like to blame all of the chaos on who? Satan, the devil, all these things. Paul goes, no. Don't worry about all these silly genealogies and irreverent myths. What does Genesis, and this is me kind of going back to, originally what it says after the reference to the Nephilim and to the sons of God and the daughters of men and the men of renown. All of that goes down in Genesis chapter 6, but I want to read this again. In Genesis 6, verse 5, it said this, the Lord saw the wickedness of who? Man. The reason Christ came was because of the wickedness and sinfulness of man. That is why he came. Not because of some extra figure, not because of some angel, not even because of the serpent. Man rebelled, man was wicked, therefore redemption had to take place. The flood had to come because man, it says the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil. Whose heart? His heart. Whose heart? Man's heart. That is the brokenness. So nowhere does God go, and this is another theory too when you get to the Nephilim and stuff, and to the sons of God. They're like, that's why God flooded the earth. He had to, because of all the angelic beings and all the crazy hybrid people that were walking around. That's kind of an argument that gets used, and I kind of see that, and I go, that puts all of the punishment that God lays out, it puts it on what? It ain't really us, it's them. They came down. We're just kind of bystanders, and like all the angelic beings are doing all the crazy stuff. The reason why Christ comes to the cross is to pay for the sin of man. So that is the point of all of this. The application is this. We can run off in 1,000 different directions and look at this, and what about this theory? All that stuff is fine. But in the New Testament, we are to put our hand to the plow, and we are to be faithful, and we are to be good stewards, and we are to be salt and light. Jesus nowhere in the Gospels mentions this. Even some of the texts that we have in referencing in Jude and in 1 Peter, even those texts don't really elaborate on it, nor does Paul ever go into any detail about, hey, be really, really concerned about all of these things that are happening with the Nephilim and giants. And then there's this kind of movement now that's like, there's giants today, man. There's 30, 40-foot people that have been caught on camera in places. And you just kind of hear all of this stuff, and it goes, dude, what in the world? Like, put that to bed. I think a lot of the stuff has been inflated. Now, were there giant men? Yeah, 100%. I think that's pretty clear that there were big guys. Were there evil and destructive? Most of this is the Lord saw the wickedness of man. So it is both violent, they're both aggressive and violent, killing, as you see Cain and Abel happening immediately, as well as just sexual-like debauchery that is everywhere. And the Lord floods the earth, but He keeps a remnant. He keeps Noah and his family. And He preserves the line, the promised line, from Seth to Noah, from Noah to Abraham, from Abraham to David, from David to Christ. And I'm going to close with Hebrews. I'm going to close with this text. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1, and we'll be done. And listen, don't get me wrong. It is interesting. It is very interesting to read these things, right? I don't think at all it is not like an interesting thing to go, hey, let's read this. Let's see kind of what this says. Like, of course, it's interesting. But obviously, we don't have a lot of expounding on it, and we need to be cautious and careful. We need to be cautious and careful that we don't miss the forest because of one tree. So Hebrews 1, verse 1 says this: long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, He has spoken to us by His Son, whom He has appointed the heir of all things, through whom also He created the world. Christ is the focus. Christ is the King. He's the only one that can atone for sin. And ultimately this, if there were giants and there was all these crazy things, who is the giant crusher? The Lord. Who is the destroyer of giants? The Lord. Because you will see that as the Israelites later on, they get victory over all of those groups. And who slayed a giant on the battlefield one-on-one? David did. All of that to preserve God's people. All of that to redeem His people. All of that is so that Christ would come, that He would die, pay the penalty for sin, and that He would call His people to Himself. So a beautiful picture. So if there were giants and crazy stuff, there absolutely may have been. But at the same time, we have the crusher of giants in Jesus, and we have the crusher of Satan in Jesus Christ. That's where our hope lies. That's where our focus is. So let us not get all off base, running 1,000 miles an hour, looking at other things, but focus on the main thing. Look at this stuff, explore it, examine it. It's in the Scriptures. We should do our due diligence, but nobody is just like 100% like going, everybody believes this one thing. And so I think we need to kind of just be mindful of that when we look at these texts. So guys, thank you for tonight. You guys watching online and those who are here in person, we will see you Sunday at 10 a.m. as we continue our series on the Sermon on the Mount.